"You're too small, but I'll make it fit," the towering rancher whispered to the trembling black mail-order bride stepping off the dusty stagecoach, his massive frame casting a shadow over her delicate form. The frontier town watches with cruel anticipation, wagering how quickly this mismatched pair will crumble under the weight of their obvious differences. They see a fragile city woman destined for heartbreak and failure in the unforgiving wilderness. But the gentle giant who awaits her carries secrets of loneliness and a failing ranch teetering on the edge of ruin. She clutches a mysterious leather satchel containing tools that could either save them both or destroy any chance of acceptance in this hostile community. Can two outcasts forge something lasting from their desperate arrangement, or will the very thing that might rescue them tear apart everything they're trying to build? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a cloud of Wyoming dust. Eleonora Green stepped down onto the wooden platform, her polished boots meeting the rough planks of Copper Valley. The year was 1878, and she had traveled further from Philadelphia than she ever imagined possible. Curious eyes turned toward her. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A well-dressed black woman was not a common sight in this remote frontier settlement. She smoothed her traveling dress and lifted her chin, determined not to show the fear churning in her stomach. A shadow fell across her path. She looked up to see a man who seemed to block out the sun itself. Malcolm Everett stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his work shirt. His weathered hands could have wrapped around her waist twice over. The townspeople stepped back instinctively. Even the stagecoach driver seemed eager to complete his business and leave. Malcolm's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Miss Green?" She nodded, unable to find her voice. He noticed her small traveling bag and reached for it with surprising gentleness. "Welcome to Copper Valley." The ride to his ranch passed in awkward silence. Ellie clutched a worn leather satchel in her lap, the weight of it both comforting and heavy with secrets. Through the wagon's side, she watched endless stretches of grassland punctuated by distant mountains. Malcolm's ranch house sat alone against the vast landscape. It was modest, but well-maintained. As they approached, she noticed something odd. The porch railing had been lowered. The front steps seemed shorter than they should be for a man of his size. Inside, more peculiarities revealed themselves. Kitchen shelves hung at unusual heights. A footstool sat beside the wash basin. He had tried to modify his world for someone much smaller. "I wasn't sure what you'd need," he said, watching her take in the changes. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the window, she saw 3 women riding up the path with the determination of an invading army. Agnes Brickwood dismounted first. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back severely, and her dress spoke of Eastern refinement transplanted to frontier soil. She was clearly the type of woman who appointed herself guardian of community standards. "We've come to meet your new arrangement," Mrs. Brickwood announced, sweeping into the house without invitation. Her companions followed. Mrs. Porter, thin and nervous. Mrs. Caldwell, whose expensive riding habit suggested significant wealth. They formed a semicircle around Ellie like judges at a tribunal. "How interesting," Mrs. Brickwood said, her tone suggesting anything but genuine interest. "And where exactly did you say you were from, dear?" "Philadelphia." "How refined. And your previous employment?" "I was a seamstress." The women exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Mrs. Porter whispered something behind her gloved hand. "Well," Mrs. Brickwood continued, "frontier life is quite different from city comforts. The work is demanding. The isolation can be overwhelming. Many arrangements like this prove to be temporary." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Ellie will do just fine." "Of course she will," Mrs. Brickwood replied with false sweetness. "I'm sure you'll both discover exactly how well suited you are to this situation." After the women departed, an uncomfortable quiet settled over the house. Malcolm busied himself with preparing a simple dinner, while Ellie explored her new surroundings. Everything felt oversized for her, yet she could see his careful attempts to accommodate her presence. The sound of another horse approaching broke their silence. This time, Sheriff Luke Mathers dismounted alone. He was a man in his 40s with the measured movements of someone accustomed to keeping peace in difficult situations. "Evening, Malcolm, ma'am." He touched his hat toward Ellie. Wanted to stop by and offer a proper welcome to Copper Valley. His tone was diplomatic but carried an undertone of concern. "Appreciate that, Sheriff. Things can be challenging out here for folks who are still finding their place in the community. Just wanted you both to know my door's always open if you need anything." The warning was politely delivered, but unmistakable. As darkness fell, a third visitor arrived. Grace Morgan was a widow who worked a small spread adjacent to Malcolm's land. Unlike the earlier visitors, she came bearing fresh bread and genuine warmth. "Thought you might appreciate something homemade after your journey," she said, handing the loaf to Ellie. "That's very kind." Grace studied Ellie with curious but friendly eyes. "Takes courage to start over in a new place. Hope you'll find what you're looking for here." Later, as Malcolm tended to the evening chores, Ellie walked the perimeter of the house. In the fading light, she could see cattle in the distant pastures. Even from this distance, something about their behavior troubled her. Several animals moved with the listless gait she recognized all too well. She gripped her leather satchel tighter. Inside were instruments and remedies that represented knowledge passed down from her father, knowledge that could change everything. But revealing that knowledge would mean exposing secrets she had traveled 1,000 miles to protect. Malcolm returned from the barn, his massive frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. He found her standing on the modified porch, staring out at land that now represented both their futures. "The cattle," she said quietly. "How long have they been sick?" His surprise was evident. "What makes you think they're sick?" She realized her mistake immediately. A seamstress from Philadelphia shouldn't know anything about livestock, but the words had already escaped. "I just noticed some of them seemed to be moving strangely." Malcolm studied her face in the lamplight filtering through the window. For a moment, she thought he might press the question. Instead, he simply nodded. "Been losing them for months. Can't figure out what's wrong." Ellie's hand moved instinctively toward her satchel, then stopped. The choice before her felt impossibly heavy. Remain silent and watch his livelihood crumble, or reveal the truth and risk everything she had fled Philadelphia to escape. The morning sun revealed the full extent of Malcolm's troubles. Ellie followed him across the pastures, her boots sinking into the soft earth. Up close, the cattle's condition was worse than she had imagined from the house. Several animals stood with their heads lowered, breathing labored. Others had stopped eating entirely. The symptoms painted a clear picture that made her chest tighten with recognition. "Doc Miller came out last month," Malcolm said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Said there wasn't much to be done. Told me to prepare for losing most of the herd." Ellie watched a young calf struggle to keep up with its mother. The sight broke something loose inside her chest. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her that knowledge unused was knowledge wasted. "What did Doc Miller diagnose?" Malcolm shrugged. "Said it was probably some kind of lung fever. Claimed it would run its course." The words hit her like a physical blow. Lung fever was treatable if caught early. These animals were suffering needlessly. "Malcolm," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to tell you something." He turned toward her and she saw her own reflection in his eyes, a small woman in traveling clothes who was supposed to know about fabric and thread, not livestock and disease. "My father wasn't just any man in Philadelphia. He was Dr. James Green." The name clearly meant nothing to Malcolm, but she pressed on. "He was one of the first colored veterinarians in Pennsylvania. Maybe the first. He taught me everything he knew because he believed knowledge shouldn't die with the person who carries it." Malcolm's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been hope. "You're saying you know about animal medicine?" "I'm saying your cattle don't have lung fever. They have parasitic bronchitis. And it's completely treatable." She walked to the nearest sick animal, a young bull that barely lifted his head at her approach. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, checking his gums, listening to his breathing, examining his eyes. "See how his breathing is shallow but rapid? The way his ribs show, even though there's grass everywhere? Classic signs of lungworm infestation. Malcolm followed her movements with growing amazement. Doc Miller never mentioned parasites. Doc Miller probably learned his veterinary skills from a farmer's almanac. The words came out sharper than she intended. These animals need specific treatment, not folk remedies. She returned to the house and retrieved her leather satchel. Inside were instruments her father had crafted himself, alongside vials of compounds she had prepared before leaving Philadelphia. Malcolm watched in silence as she laid out tools he had never seen before. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "Since the moment I saw them yesterday. But I was afraid to say anything." "Afraid of what?" She met his eyes directly. "Afraid that a woman who knows too much might not be welcome here." Understanding passed between them without words. In a world where women were expected to know their place and colored folks were expected to know theirs, her knowledge represented a dangerous combination. "What do you need?" Malcolm asked. The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid her composure. "Help catching them, and trust that I know what I'm doing." They worked through the morning methodically. Ellie administered treatments while Malcolm held each animal steady. Her movements were precise and confident, backed by years of training that few people in the territory could match. Word traveled fast in a small community. By afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. Grace Morgan arrived first, followed by Tom Peterson from the neighboring spread. Even Sheriff Mathers rode out to see what was happening. "Heard there was some kind of doctoring going on," Peterson said, dismounting near the corral where Ellie was examining another animal. Grace watched Ellie work with obvious fascination. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Philadelphia." The simple answer satisfied no one, but Ellie offered no elaboration. She finished her examination and marked notes in a small journal. "These treatments," Sheriff Mathers said carefully, "are they something Doc Miller recommended?" "Doc Miller diagnosed lung fever," Malcolm replied. "Ellie thinks it's something else entirely." Peterson laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what would a seamstress from back east know about cattle diseases? Ellie straightened to her full height, which still left her looking up at every man present. "I know that these animals will start showing improvement within 48 hours. I know that the treatments I've administered will clear their systems of parasites Doc Miller never bothered to test for. And I know that this herd will not only survive, but thrive." "That's quite a claim," Peterson said. "Yes, it is." The crowd dispersed with murmured conversations and backward glances. Only Grace remained, helping Ellie clean her instruments. "Your father must have been quite a teacher," Grace said quietly. "He was the best man I ever knew." "And he taught you all of this?" Ellie nodded. "He said knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away from you, even when they took everything else." 2 days later, Malcolm found Ellie in the kitchen before dawn, staring out the window toward the pastures. The cattle were moving differently. Several animals that had barely lifted their heads were now grazing normally. "It's working," he said. "It's working." By the end of the week, the transformation was undeniable. Animals that had been listless and dying were alert and healthy. The word spread through Copper Valley like wildfire. Some neighbors arrived asking quiet questions about their own livestock problems. Others came with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Mrs. Brickwood appeared with 2 other women, their faces set in disapproving lines. "Quite remarkable," Mrs. Brickwood said, watching healthy cattle graze where sick ones had stood the week before. "One might wonder where a seamstress acquired such unusual skills." "One might wonder why it matters as long as the animals are healthy," Malcolm replied evenly. "Oh, it matters," Mrs. Brickwood said. "In a proper community, it matters very much indeed." But the cattle continued to thrive, and word of Ellie's success spread beyond Copper Valley. The truth was out now, impossible to contain. She was no ordinary mail-order bride, and their arrangement had become something neither of them had expected. The rumors started before the sun rose on Monday morning. Mrs. Brickwood had been busy over the weekend, visiting every respectable household in Copper Valley. By breakfast time, half the town was whispering about unnatural healing and dark practices. Ellie heard the whispers when she accompanied Malcolm to the general store. Conversations stopped when she entered. Eyes followed her movements as she examined supplies. The storekeeper's wife served her with obvious reluctance. "Mighty strange how those cattle recovered so quick," someone muttered behind the pickle barrels. "Ain't natural for a woman to know such things." Especially that kind of woman. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but Ellie placed a gentle hand on his arm. She had expected this reaction. Her father had faced worse in Philadelphia, where education and accomplishment were supposed to matter more than skin color. The first test came Tuesday afternoon. Grace Morgan arrived with Tom Peterson in tow, his hat literally in his hands. "Tom's got a sick horse," Grace explained. "Been off its feed for a week. Doc Miller says there's nothing to be done." Peterson looked uncomfortable, asking for help from someone he had dismissed days earlier. "Grace says you might take a look." Ellie examined the mare carefully. The animal was dehydrated and listless, with telltale signs of colic. Another condition Doc Miller had apparently misdiagnosed. "She needs mineral oil and walking," Ellie said, "every hour for the next 6 hours. Then a specific herbal mixture I can prepare. And if we don't do this, you'll lose her by Friday." Peterson followed her instructions precisely. The mare recovered completely. Word spread faster than prairie fire. Within a week, 3 more neighbors had quietly sought Ellie's help. A dairy cow with mastitis, sheep showing signs of foot rot, a prize bull that had stopped breeding. Each case presented challenges that Doc Miller had either ignored or misunderstood. Each success built Ellie's reputation while simultaneously fueling opposition to her presence. Mrs. Brickwood organized her campaign with military precision. She hosted afternoon teas where concerned citizens discussed the threat to proper order. She visited the minister to express worries about ungodly practices. She even wrote letters to territorial authorities about unlicensed medical activity. The breaking point came when Thomas Caldwell arrived at Malcolm's ranch unannounced. Caldwell owned the largest spread in the territory and carried influence to match his wealth. "Heard you've got quite a talented woman here," Caldwell said, dismounting from an expensive stallion. "Ellie knows her business," Malcolm replied carefully. Caldwell studied Ellie with calculating eyes. "I've got cattle problems money can't seem to solve. Lost 40 head this season alone. Doc Miller's treatments aren't working. Maybe you should ask Ellie to take a look." "That's exactly what I'm here to discuss." Caldwell's attention shifted entirely to Ellie. "I'll pay you $50 a month plus room and board to manage my livestock health. That's more money than most men in this territory see." The offer hung in the air like a thunderclap. $50 was a fortune by frontier standards. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Caldwell, but I'm content where I am." "Think about it carefully," Caldwell pressed. "A woman with your skills could do very well for herself. Better than playing house on a struggling ranch." Malcolm stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Caldwell. "She's given you her answer." Caldwell smiled coldly. "Of course. Just wanted to make sure she understood her options." After Caldwell left, the attacks intensified. Mrs. Brickwood's whisper campaign became an open assault. She organized a town meeting to address what she called the situation. The meeting drew the largest crowd in Copper Valley's history. The small church overflowed with ranchers, shopkeepers, and their families. Mrs. Brickwood had done her work well. "We have a duty to maintain standards," she announced from the front of the room. "When unqualified persons practice medicine, they endanger our entire community." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Furthermore, we must consider the moral implications of allowing such activities to continue unchecked." Sheriff Mathers sat in the back, his expression carefully neutral. Grace Morgan occupied a middle pew, her face set in determined lines. "I propose we petition the territorial authorities to investigate these irregular medical practices," Mrs. Brickwood continued. "What irregular practices?" Grace stood up, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "Healing sick animals? Saving people's livelihoods? Mrs. Morgan, please remember your place. My place is standing up for what's right. Ellie Green has done more good in 2 weeks than Doc Miller has done in 2 years." Other voices joined the argument. Tom Peterson stood to defend Ellie's treatment of his horse. Two more ranchers spoke about successful treatments she had provided, but Mrs. Brickwood had prepared for opposition. "These temporary improvements prove nothing," she declared. "We're dealing with forces beyond our understanding, practices that have no place in a Christian community." The implied accusation hung heavy in the air. Witchcraft, devil worship, the kinds of charges that could destroy lives on the frontier. Sheriff Mathers finally stood. His presence commanded immediate attention. "I've heard enough accusations," he said quietly. "Now I want to hear facts. Mrs. Green, would you explain exactly what you've been doing?" Ellie rose from her seat, feeling every eye in the room focus on her. This was the moment she had dreaded and prepared for since leaving Philadelphia. "My father was Dr. James Green," she began, her voice steady despite the hostility surrounding her. "He studied veterinary medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He taught me anatomy, pharmacology, and diagnostic techniques because he believed knowledge should serve wherever it's needed." She continued speaking, explaining her training and methods with scientific precision. Several people shifted uncomfortably as her obvious expertise became undeniable. "I use the same principles any trained veterinarian would use," she concluded. "The only difference is that I learned from someone who happened to be my father instead of a professor in a classroom." The room fell silent. Mrs. Brickwood's face had gone pale. Sheriff Mathers nodded slowly. "Sounds like proper medical training to me. I don't see any laws being broken. But surely the territorial authorities should make that determination," Mrs. Brickwood protested. "Maybe they should," Mathers replied. "But until they do, Mrs. Green has every right to help her neighbors." The meeting dissolved into heated discussions and uncertain glances. As people filed out, the community remained clearly divided. But something important had changed. Ellie had declared herself openly, and Sheriff Mathers had taken a stand. The real battle was just beginning. The first snow arrived 2 weeks early, carried on winds that howled down from the mountains with unprecedented fury. What began as scattered flakes became a relentless assault that transformed the Wyoming landscape into a frozen wasteland. Malcolm stood at the kitchen window, watching the storm intensify. "Never seen it come this hard this fast." Ellie joined him, noting the way the wind drove snow horizontally across the pastures. Her father had taught her to read weather patterns, and everything about this storm spelled disaster for livestock across the valley. "The cattle will need shelter," she said. "Already moved them to the lower pastures near the windbreaks. But if this keeps up—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood the implications. A storm of this magnitude could wipe out entire herds, destroying the economic foundation of every ranch in Copper Valley. By evening, the temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels. Malcolm made repeated trips to the barn, checking on their animals and ensuring adequate feed remained accessible. Each journey became more treacherous as snow accumulated in deep drifts. The first call for help came before dawn. Tom Peterson rode through the blizzard on a horse that could barely navigate the drifts. "Lost 12 head already," he shouted over the wind. "Found them frozen solid in the north pasture. The rest are scattered. Don't know how to bring them in safely." Ellie grabbed her medical bag and heaviest coat. "We need to reach them before hypothermia sets in completely." "You can't go out in this," Malcolm protested. "Those animals will die without immediate treatment. Hypothermia requires specific interventions within a narrow time window." They rode out together, following Peterson through snow that reached their horses' bellies. The world had become a whiteout of driving snow and bitter wind. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Peterson's remaining cattle huddled against a rocky outcropping, their coats encrusted with ice. Several animals lay motionless in the snow. Ellie dismounted and began examining them immediately. "This one's still alive," she called, kneeling beside a young bull whose breathing was barely detectable. "Help me get him upright." She worked methodically, checking each animal for signs of life. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the numbing cold. 3 more cattle showed faint vital signs. "We need to warm their core temperature gradually," she instructed. "Too fast, and we'll kill them ourselves." Using techniques her father had taught her during harsh Philadelphia winters, She directed the men in moving the surviving animals to better shelter. She administered stimulants to improve circulation and wrapped the weakest animals in whatever blankets they could spare. Word of their rescue efforts spread through the valley's communication network of desperate neighbors. Before noon, Grace Morgan arrived with news that the Hendersons had lost their entire dairy herd. 23 head, Grace reported. Everything they had. More requests for help followed throughout the day. The Caldwells had cattle trapped in a box canyon. The Petersons' sheep were scattered across 3 miles of open range. Doc Miller had declared the situation hopeless and retreated to town to wait out the storm. Ellie made a decision that would define everything that followed. "We're going to help everyone we can reach," she announced. "Every animal we save means a family doesn't lose their livelihood." Malcolm stared at her through the swirling snow. That could mean riding for days in these conditions. Then, we ride for days. They spent the next 72 hours in continuous motion, traveling from ranch to ranch as the storm raged around them. Ellie treated cases of frostbite, hypothermia, and exposure with supplies that dwindled rapidly. She improvised treatments using materials found on each ranch. At the Caldwell spread, they found Thomas Caldwell himself working desperately to save cattle trapped in the canyon. His expensive clothes were ruined, his hands bloody from handling frozen rope. He looked up as Ellie approached with her medical bag. "Didn't expect to see you out here," he said. "Animals don't care about politics during a blizzard." She worked for 6 hours straight, treating his cattle with the same care she had shown everyone else's livestock. When they finally freed the last animal from the canyon, Caldwell watched her with something approaching respect. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. Your cattle needed help." By the 4th day, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind died to manageable levels, and visibility improved enough to survey the full extent of the damage. The valley had been transformed into an alien landscape of snowdrifts and ice. Sheriff Mathers rode out to check on isolated ranches, finding Ellie and Malcolm at the Morrison place, treating the last of several critical cases. "Heard you two have been making rounds," he said. "Someone had to," Malcolm replied. Mathers surveyed the scene. 3 cattle that had been near death were now standing and alert. Mrs. Morrison was preparing hot food for everyone involved in the rescue effort. Doc Miller estimated the valley would lose 60% of its livestock, Mathers continued. "Preliminary counts suggest we'll lose less than 20%. That's the difference between economic disaster and manageable losses." The numbers told only part of the story. Ellie's interventions had prevented not just animal deaths but human catastrophe. Families who would have faced complete ruin now had hope for rebuilding. As word spread of her efforts during the crisis, something fundamental shifted in Copper Valley's social dynamics. People who had viewed her with suspicion now spoke of her with gratitude. Even some of Mrs. Brickwood's strongest allies began questioning their previous opposition. Grace Morgan organized a community gathering to thank everyone who had helped during the storm. The meeting drew twice as many people as Mrs. Brickwood's hostile assembly had attracted. "We owe our survival to neighbors who risked everything to help others," Grace announced. "Particularly those who brought knowledge and skills we desperately needed." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Ellie found herself surrounded by people offering thanks, requesting her continued services, and treating her as a valued community member. Even Mrs. Brickwood attended, though she remained silent throughout the proceedings. But the storm had brought more than just acceptance. A letter waited at the ranch when they finally returned home, bearing a Philadelphia postmark and news that would challenge everything they had begun to build together. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the same stagecoach that had brought Ellie to Copper Valley months earlier. She recognized the elegant handwriting immediately and felt her stomach drop. Malcolm noticed her reaction as she held the unopened envelope. "Bad news?" "I don't know yet." She retreated to the privacy of their bedroom before breaking the wax seal. The letter was from Dr. Harrison Webb, her father's former colleague at the University of Pennsylvania. The words blurred as she read them twice, then a third time. "Doctor, Webb wrote that her father's extensive research notes and clinical observations were being donated to establish the first comprehensive veterinary curriculum in the country. The new Philadelphia College of Veterinary Medicine wanted her to help develop the program. Her hands trembled as she absorbed the implications. This was the opportunity her father had dreamed of but never lived to see, a chance to legitimize veterinary medicine as a true profession rather than a collection of folk remedies and guesswork. More importantly, it was a chance to become one of the first officially recognized veterinarians in America. Not just a woman practicing animal medicine in secret, but a credentialed professional with institutional backing. Malcolm found her sitting on the bed an hour later, the letter still clutched in her hands. "What does it say?" She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it slowly, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "This is important," he said finally. "It's everything my father worked toward his entire life. Then you have to go." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. "Malcolm, this is bigger than us, Ellie. Bigger than Copper Valley. You could change how the whole country thinks about animal medicine." She looked at him through eyes that had begun to fill with tears. "And leave behind everything we've built here? What we've built will always be here. But this opportunity won't wait." The next few days passed in a haze of difficult conversations and sleepless nights. Word of the Philadelphia offer somehow spread through the Valley's gossip network. People began treating her differently, as if she were already gone. Grace Morgan arrived Thursday afternoon with fresh bread and obvious concerns. "Heard you might be leaving us," she said without preamble. "Nothing's decided yet. But you're considering it." Ellie nodded reluctantly. Grace set down the bread and took her hands. "I won't pretend we don't need you here, but I also won't pretend this isn't the chance of a lifetime." The community response surprised Ellie with its complexity. Some people seemed relieved at the prospect of her departure, still uncomfortable with her unconventional knowledge and status. Others appeared genuinely distressed at losing someone who had become essential to their livestock operations. Sheriff Mathers stopped by Friday evening with news that complicated her decision further. "Been corresponding with territorial authorities about establishing an official veterinary position," he said. "Territory's growing fast. Need someone with proper credentials to oversee livestock health on a larger scale. You're offering me a job? Offering you the chance to build something permanent here. Official recognition, government backing, salary and authority to go with your skills." The offer represented legitimacy and stability in a place where she had found acceptance. It also meant staying with Malcolm and the community they had fought to build together. But it paled in comparison to the Philadelphia opportunity. Tom Peterson organized what he called a community appreciation dinner at the church. Nearly everyone in Copper Valley attended, including people who had initially opposed her presence. "Want to make sure you know how much you mean to all of us," Peterson announced. "Whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here." Even Mrs. Brickwood approached her after the dinner, her manner stiff but sincere. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment. You've proven yourself to be exactly what this community needed." "Thank you for saying that." "I hope you'll consider staying, but I also hope you'll do what's best for your future." The most difficult conversation came Sunday morning when Malcolm found her staring out at the pastures where healthy cattle grazed in the spring sunshine. "You've made your decision," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to go to Philadelphia." He nodded slowly. "I know. But I don't want to lose what we have here. You won't lose it. Distance doesn't change what matters." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their cattle graze peacefully. Everything around them represented months of hard work and growing trust between two people who had started as strangers. "There might be a way," Ellie said finally. "What kind of way?" "The program needs 6 months to establish the curriculum. After that, they'll need practitioners to test the methods in different environments." Malcolm turned toward her, hope flickering in his eyes. "You're talking about coming back. I'm talking about spending half the year in Philadelphia helping train the next generation of veterinarians, and half the year here putting those methods into practice. And I could visit Philadelphia, learn about new ranching techniques they're developing back east. The solution felt right in a way that permanent separation never could. They could honor her father's legacy while building their own future together. It would mean being apart sometimes. It would also mean building something bigger than either of us could create alone. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table and began writing 2 letters. The first accepted the Philadelphia position with conditions about returning to Wyoming. The second informed Sheriff Mathers that she would accept the territorial veterinary position on a part-time basis. Malcolm watched her write, occasionally offering suggestions about timing and logistics. They were planning a future that honored both their individual dreams and their shared commitment to each other. The letters would go out on Tuesday's Stagecoach, setting in motion changes that would reshape both their lives. But for now, they sat together in the house he had modified for her, planning a marriage of true partnership that would bridge 2 worlds. 1 year later, the same stagecoach that had first brought Ellie to Copper Valley rolled to a stop at the familiar wooden platform. But this time, half the town had gathered to welcome her home. Malcolm stood at the front of the crowd, his massive frame unchanged, but his expression transformed by joy and anticipation. 6 months in Philadelphia had felt like 6 years, despite the letters they had exchanged weekly. Ellie stepped down, wearing a new dress and carrying official documents that certified her as a licensed veterinarian. The Philadelphia College of Veterinary Medicine had not only accepted her contributions, but had requested her permanent involvement in their program. "Dr. Green," Sheriff Mathers said formally, touching his hat, "welcome back." The title felt strange, but right. She had earned it through months of rigorous examination and practical demonstration. The professors in Philadelphia had initially been skeptical of a woman who claimed extensive veterinary knowledge learned outside their institution. Her father's detailed notes and her own diagnostic abilities had quickly silenced their doubts. Grace Morgan pushed through the crowd to embrace her warmly. "The valley hasn't been the same without you." Tom Peterson stepped forward with his hat in his hands, just as he had months earlier when seeking help for his mare. "Got a cow that's been acting peculiar. Doc Miller says she's fine, but—" "She'll look at your cow tomorrow," Malcolm interrupted, wrapping his arms around Ellie. "Today she's home." The reunion celebration lasted well into the evening. Nearly everyone in Copper Valley attended, including families who had initially opposed her presence. They brought food, stories of the livestock problems that had arisen during her absence, and genuine expressions of gratitude for her return. Mrs. Brickwood approached during the quieter moments of the evening. Her transformation over the past year had been remarkable to witness. "I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our early encounters," she said. "I'm ashamed of how I behaved. You were protecting your community the way you thought best. I was protecting my prejudices. There's a difference." The older woman paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been corresponding with my sister in Denver. Told her about you and your work here. She's been advocating for similar medical services in her area." It was a small acknowledgement, but it represented a complete reversal from the woman who had once organized opposition meetings. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Ellie resumed her veterinary practice with enhanced knowledge gained from her Philadelphia experience. The new techniques she had learned proved invaluable for conditions that had previously baffled local ranchers. Malcolm had spent her absence expanding their ranch and implementing modern agricultural methods he had researched through correspondence with Eastern experts. Their partnership had grown stronger through separation, each bringing new skills to their shared enterprise. The official territorial veterinary position became a reality in late spring. Governor Hoyt himself traveled from Cheyenne to present Ellie with her commission, making her the first licensed veterinarian in Wyoming Territory. "The territory's livestock industry depends on professional medical care," the governor announced at the ceremony. "Dr. Green represents the kind of expertise we need to build a modern agricultural economy." The ceremony took place in Copper Valley's church, the same building where Mrs. Brickwood had once organized opposition to Ellie's presence. Now the entire community gathered to celebrate her official recognition. Sheriff Mathers had been promoted to territorial marshal, partly due to his progressive approach to community development. His support of Ellie during the difficult early months had gained attention from territorial authorities, impressed by Copper Valley's agricultural success. The marriage ceremony followed 2 weeks later. Malcolm and Ellie had been legally wed by proxy when she first arrived, but they wanted a real wedding celebration with their community. Grace Morgan organized the event with military precision. The church was decorated with wildflowers from the mountain meadows. Tables were arranged outside for a feast that featured contributions from every family in the valley. "We're gathered to celebrate the union of two people who have built something special together," the minister began. "Malcolm Everett and Dr. Eleonora Green have shown us what's possible when different worlds come together in mutual respect and love." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Malcolm's voice rumbled as he spoke vows about partnership and support. Ellie promised to share her life between Philadelphia and Wyoming, building bridges between East and West. When he said, "I'll make it fit," during his vows, referencing their first conversation, the entire congregation understood the deeper meaning. They had indeed made their different lives fit together through compromise, growth, and determination. The celebration continued long into the evening. Musicians played while couples danced under lanterns strung between the trees. Children ran between the tables while adults shared stories and made plans for the future. Thomas Caldwell approached during a quiet moment, extending his hand to Malcolm. "Wanted to offer my congratulations and my apologies for how I behaved initially." "Appreciate that, Thomas." Caldwell turned to Ellie. "I've been thinking about your Philadelphia connections. Wondered if you might help me establish better breeding programs using Eastern bloodlines." The request represented complete acceptance from someone who had once tried to lure her away from Malcolm. As the evening wound down, Malcolm and Ellie found themselves alone on their modified porch, watching the last guests depart across the moonlit valley. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About which decision?" "Any of them." She leaned against his solid warmth, feeling the contentment of someone who had found her place in the world. "The only regret I have is that my father couldn't see this. He would have loved knowing his knowledge helped build something lasting. Maybe he does know." 3 months later, Ellie received a letter from the University of Pennsylvania requesting her assistance in establishing veterinary programs in other frontier territories. Her work in Wyoming had become a model for bringing professional animal medicine to developing regions. Their ranch had become a destination for visitors wanting to learn about modern agricultural techniques. Neighboring territories sent representatives to study their methods. Eastern investors sought partnerships based on their proven success, but the most important changes were personal. Malcolm and Ellie had created a marriage based on mutual respect, shared goals, and the understanding that love meant supporting each other's dreams rather than limiting them. Their story became legendary in Copper Valley, told to newcomers as proof that differences in background, education, or appearance meant nothing compared to character and determination. Standing together on their porch each evening, they could see the results of their partnership across the thriving valley, knowing they had built something neither could have achieved alone.